Hello there, everyone. It's Peter here, and it's just a very, very brief public service announcement from me to say that something different's happening on YouTube this week as a bit of an experiment, I suppose. We're going to put up the Zoom meeting video footage, if I can say it properly, which I think is probably worthwhile because the guest this week is someone whose face you might know. It's Neil Oliver. That's not his face, obviously, on the front. It's an old person's face. But author of these great books about the past. In particular, we'll talk about this one, which is The Story of the World in 100 Moments. But we're off, really, on a travel back to Neolithic Orkney. So I hope you enjoy it.
All right, well, I'll start off by saying, Neil Oliver, it's an absolute treat to be talking to you today. Welcome to Travel Through Time, our little podcast about history and all matters time traveling through the past. And it's just a pleasure to be talking to you again. The occasion of our conversation, of course, is the new book, The Story of the World in 100 Moments. We've spoken a little bit about this book already, which is just out in the shops now. It's a great, big, broad look at our human past. And you said it was the hardest book you've ever written. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the book and the process that brought it about?
Sure. Good. First of all, it's great to be talking to you again. I've been enjoying our conversation so far, so it's just another opportunity to take it a bit further, see where we get to. The book was it was written in lockdown. Coincidentally, I had the commission to write the book anyway. It was going to happen. It was part of a 2-book deal that I had, and it was the time I would have been writing the book anyway, but it happened to overlap with, it wasn't as though I'd made a decision to write a book during lockdown. And I found it, as it turned out, I know a lot of people found lockdown very productive, especially the beginning of it when it was a novelty. I think a lot of people reported finding it a time of great creativity, and they had, the peace and quiet and so on. I learned that I work better in a busy, noisy house. I've got 3 kids, and I'm not actually there at the moment. I'm in a holiday house as you speak to me, but my kids are not far away, and the constant in and out of my office, interruptions, other things to do, busy normal life. I found, as it turns out, I need that as part of the, I don't know, I suppose part of the adrenaline that powers me through a writing project. So I found this one slower than normal. But it was also difficult because I had embarked upon something which, to write a history of the world is always that's a monumental task for anyone. And I'm not a historian. I'm certainly not an academic historian. I'm a history enthusiast. I'm an archaeologist, and I love my history, and I love, my shelves are lined with history books. And so what I decided I would do was, it's not intended to be a history book, which is why it's called The Story of the World in 100 Moments. And I thought the way I would do it was to imagine 100, what seemed to me salient stepping stones from then to now. I started with the advent of writing, because I thought for history, that seems like the perfect place to begin. And some of the moments will be instantly familiar to readers. Others, I hope, they'll be encountering some stories and some characters for the first time. But they seem to me the stories that give some kind of illumination to how we've got from, how we've travelled through 5,000 years as a species. It's supposed to be eclectic and idiosyncratic. They're very much my choices, and I would hope, amongst other things, people reading it might say, but you've not mentioned this and you didn't mention that, and thereby other people might compile, consciously or not, their own 100 moments that seem to them the moments that tell the story of the world. But nonetheless, it was Herculean. Really, once it was easy to write the title, The Story of the World in 100 Moments. But when I sat down to trying to decide on the 100, it was just massive. I suppose I quickly alighted on maybe 50 or 60 moments. I thought, well, I really have to mention these for it to be credible at all. But winnowing down the last 40 or 50, whatever it was was massive. I was almost head in hands with the enormity of what I had taken on. And it was partly collegiate. I submitted my typescript, and the editors came back and said, we really think the book would benefit from mentioning such and such. For example, one editor who looked at it said, you haven't mentioned football. Surely, that's the biggest unifying sport on planet Earth. Can you really not have some mention of it? And I thought, no, you're probably right, but I'm just not a sport person, so that's not the way my mind works. So it was collegiate in as much as there were a few stories went out and replacements came in, and hopefully the 100 that are there do the job which I intended, which is to. It's always been my fantasy, really. I like reciting. I always enjoyed, from I was a little boy, I used to enjoy memorizing poetry and being able to recite from memory. And for a long time, I thought, how brilliant would it be if you could stand up and almost as a party trick tell the story of the world in 10 minutes, in some clever way. The book, again, that was another thing that it served. It's the realization of that fantasy, because I thought, if the time comes when I'm maybe out touring this book, I'll basically have to stand up and across an hour or two tell the story of the world. I thought, that's almost a ludicrous idea, but would be fun to do.
Well, hopefully there's a bit of a kind of synergy with what we try and do here, because when I try and explain the podcast to people, I often say it's a bit like a parlor game. So kind of imagine probably an October night where you're all sat round together in some pre-digital reality, where you can, provoke people into imagining the past. And that's exactly what you do with the book. And a good example, really, of how your book is a very personal story, or a personal selection, I should say, is the fact that there are the big moments of history there. You have Jesus Christ, you have Muhammad, you also have Caesar crossing the Rubicon, for example. But then one of your last ones is a story I wanted to ask you about, which is about a little girl in red, which is a story that probably no one else in the world would have picked, but it makes the book individual to you. Could you tell us about that, please?
I like to use, or I do use, the word haunted when I try to explain what history and archaeology mean to me. And there are certain stories that I've encountered over time that have haunted me, in that they don't ever go away. And things that I see, maybe from one day to another, I'll glimpse something, and it makes me think about that story. And I'm very aware of the recurrent image of a little girl in red. Now, anyone who's seen the Donald Sutherland movie Don't Look Now, there's a little girl he's lost his child, and he seems to keep seeing a little girl in red. I won't go into the details of what the plot actually is. And then, of course, in Schindler's List, the only moment of colour, or the only dash of colour in that epic movie about what happened to the Jewish people in Europe in the 20th century, there's a little girl who flits through the Warsaw Ghetto, seemingly overlooked by the adults, and she seems to get away, but she's just this flash of colour. She's wearing like a red duffel coat kind of thing, and then she turns up later on amongst the dead, still in her red coat. So she hasn't escaped. So even the idea that childhood innocence might have escaped the Holocaust is burst like the rest of it. And so there's that I do believe, it's not me. I think there is a recurrent image through storytelling and fiction of a little girl in red as representing something ephemeral and fragile, and maybe emblematic of that which is good. And when I was doing the research for a television documentary series and book about the Vikings, we spent some time on an island in Lake Mälaren in sort of south central Sweden, an island called Björkö, and it was a Viking trading port 1,000 years ago or more, and it was abandoned for reasons not particularly clear, and it was perfectly preserved. Nobody bothered to live on that little island again, so the preservation's amazing. And something that was discovered there with buried in a place of the highest honour, really, on the perfect plot, in a cemetery overlooking what would have been the town of Birka. It was found the skeleton of a little girl, and it's especially tiny. The archaeologist had the prescience to remove the entire block of soil in which he had begun to find her, and it was taken in its entirety and picked apart elsewhere. And now the remains of this little girl are on display in a museum, and you go and see her, and the skeleton is almost bird-like. It's reckoned that she was, maybe between 6 and 10 years old, but very small, very slight. And when her skeleton, and in particular her skull, was reconstructed, there was some evidence that she might have suffered from some or other syndrome, which may have been caused by her mother drinking alcohol while she was carrying her. But the little girl might have had quite a distinct look. Her eyes might have been wider apart than normal. There may have been a bigger space than usual between the top lip and the nose. But you'd have looked at her and thought, oh, unusual. And given where she was buried in the cemetery, it was imagined that she was someone of some significance. And the most expensive colour at the time to make for fabric was red. And there was a brooch found on her in a rib cage, which would have been pinned to a dress. And an assumption was made that if she was so valuable and of high status, that dress might have been red. And beside where she's displayed in the museum, there's a little maquette, a little representation of her, and the little figure with a strange ethereal look about her, is wearing a red dress. And ever since I encountered her, I've been haunted by her. I think about her often. Birka girl, they call her. And I connect it in my head with, and this is where we get to the little girl in red, who actually features as one of the moments. I trained as a cub reporter, a trainee journalist in Lockerbie. The newspaper that I joined was in Lockerbie, and I joined in 1991, and Pan Am 103, the terrible terrorist atrocity that the bomb exploded inside a jumbo jet and the plane came down over Lockerbie, was in 1988, and the Lockerbie inquiry was still going on while I was training as a reporter, and I did some time covering, sitting in on the inquiry, just sitting, taking notes and writing up bits and pieces of story. And of course, because of that, I became aware of the little girl in red. One of the bouquets that turned up, and there was if you remember the floral tributes to Princess Diana that filled, around Kensington Palace, something similar happened in Lockerbie. There was a huge deposit of flowers in memory and in grief, and one of them had a card on it that said, "To the little girl in the red dress who made the flight from Frankfurt so much fun. You didn't deserve this. God bless, Chaz," signed by someone called Chaz. And when you unpick the story, it turns out that one of the planes that connected with Pan Am 103 had flown from Frankfurt to London, and a family called the Rattans had joined it. They should have been on an earlier flight. Their flight was delayed, and one of those tragic coincidences meant that rather than the flight they should have been on, they got bundled onto Pan Am 103 and they died along with everyone else. And the little girl of the family was Suruchi Rattan. She was 3. And she was an Indian family, and she was wearing like a little red shalwar kameez, the little red trousers, little red top. And she'd obviously sort of bonded with this American passenger called Chaz, who was on the flight as far as London with her. And then he got onto another flight, and Suruchi and her family got onto Pan Am 103 and they died. And I'm haunted by that idea of that little girl, because the Pan Am 103 atrocity, it was, a decade and more before, the Twin Towers, but it has a bloodline that connects it. The idea of a plane, causing so much horror and so much death. And I often think about, to the little girl in the red dress who made the flight from Frankfurt so much fun. You didn't deserve this. God bless Chaz. And I to me, that little girl, and it's a long rambling anecdote, but she represents something about, if we are to matter at all as a species, we either all matter or none of us do. And And we are also from a hunting lineage as a species, and as hunters, our eyes are caught by bright things, sparkling things, or like magpies. We see things because we're born to hunt. And so something like a little girl in a red dress is just instantly eye-catching. And within the story of the World in 100 Moments, her passing, I think, has to be acknowledged and remembered, because she's only one little girl, but either we all matter. Each life weighs the same, or none of us do. And that's
Yeah.
a long rambling anecdote, but that's who the little girl in red is to me.
It's a few things. It's an affecting story about an individual, but she seems to represent, as you say, something more than that, which is maybe the kind of person who doesn't always feature in the central, motorway of history as we charge through it, but actually is representative of a much kind of wider experience than maybe some of the narrow historical events are, because we're much more likely to kind of empathize with her in a way.
Yes, I do hope so. I tried to make a conscious memorial to some people, and the fact that she's connected in my head to the little Birka girl, the little Viking girl, strange little bird of a thing that obviously in her short life she mattered so much to the people that she left behind that they gave her a very expensive burial, and they placed her in a site of great honour, so that you're left wondering who she was. But it seems self-evident that she was loved. And she's connected, therefore, in my imagination, with the little girl who died aboard Panam 103.
Yeah, and I suppose one of the allures about both those stories is the stories are not complete. History isn't straightforward and clipped at the end. It's messy, it's complicated. And it seems to me, and this is something we'll talk about a little bit later on when we talk about your particular level of imagination within history, which is really important. Can I ask you one other question about, I know right at the top of this, you made the point that you don't see yourself as a professional historian, rather someone who's enthusiastic about the past and wants to convey the past to people today. Now, it's kind of interesting to me that you have become more active as a commentator on contemporary culture, maybe in relation to things like independence movements or lockdowns. And it's something that I've been thinking about as someone who, similarly is enthusiastic about the past and tries to write about it. And I wanted to ask you, do you feel there's a form of responsibility or a feeling of responsibility for those of us who do spend our times burrowed away in libraries or reading about the past to bring the benefit of our knowledge and perspective to today's culture? Or do you think it's very much an individual thing? And
yes, I do. I think I can answer that by saying that my interest in history, it comes from my interest in the present. I'm my connection to it is because I wonder, and I've answered some of the questions for myself over the years, but I can remember wondering, why my mum and dad lived where they did. Why, we lived in Dumfries growing up. I just don't know how that happened. It's a kind of an arbitrary place to be. And my dad did the job that he did, and my mum did the work that she did. And I had sisters, and I wonder how that happened. And so that made me interested in my parents, and then in their parents. And then I discovered that both of my grandfathers had survived the First World War. And that was hugely significant to me, because I thought, God, the First World War is something that is so massive, and you tend to think of it as having happened to ghostly figures from long ago. They're all gone now. There's no surviving veterans, haven't been for a lot of years now. But for me, realizing that the men who survived to make the people who made me meant that the First World War was family business to me. Both of my grandfathers were hurt. My mum's dad very badly. He was lucky to survive. And I thought, God, if that bullet that hit him had taken a slightly different path, I just wouldn't be here at all. So I kind of took the First World War personally. Somebody had tried to kill both of my ancestors in separate incidents. And if either had been successful, I just wouldn't be here. And so I am I'm interested in I've worked as an archaeologist and I have worked as a journalist, and to me they're the same thing. Journalists dig to find out what's going on now, and archaeologists dig to find out what happened 100 years ago, or 1,000 or 10,000 years ago, and so the two are intimately interconnected to me. I'm interested in the past because I'm very interested in today. And I know that what's happening today is history. And what the period that we're living through is big. You know, the changes that are being wrought on society at the moment by all that's going on around the world. This is going to be the stuff all you had time, and it will take time before we even begin to understand what it is that has happened in these past couple of years.
I love that sense of you being almost a quester. I know you've written in a previous book about your desire to get back to that first page in the human story. It's like that's the kind of point that you're never going to get to, but it's a great pursuit. And
it's the futility of even hoping is what makes it attractive. Man's reach must always exceed his grasp. Browning, whoever it was, that inspires me. It's the idea of you're before you even embark on it, you're not going to get there, and that quixotic aspect to it makes it even more appealing to me.
Yeah, that connection between the journalistic instinct and the archaeological one, though, is something really to think about. Let's get on to the business at hand, though, because we've got somewhere to go today. And to get there, I've got to ask you the question, which is, if I gave you the opportunity to travel back through time and you could pick a year, we're not going to go for a calendar year here, because that would be a bit too tricky. But what have you picked? What would you like to go and see?
The reason I was keen to take part in this particular format that you've come up with for this podcast is because I get asked this question a lot. I'm sure archaeologists do. I get asked, if you had a time machine, where would you go? So I thought, I have thought like this before, under the provocation of a question. And where I would go, and this is the genuine answer to the question, is Skara Brae, which is the Neolithic village on West Mainland in Orkney, which is the archipelago off the north coast of Scotland.
Okay, and before I get you there, what is the kind of chronological? I know it's difficult to say exactly, but when about?
Notionally, I'm going to go with let's say 2,200 BC,
okay,
because or either that or maybe 2,500 BC. Because it would appear that was when Skara Brae was abandoned. Skara Brae is a long story. It seems to have been lived in for 600 years. And when it was first established, I mean, it's older than the Golden Age of China. It's earlier than the first cities of the Harappan civilization in India.
Yeah.
It's older than pyramids.
This is 2 millennia before, I don't know, Socrates, isn't it? This is a long time.
It's out geographically. It's out on the edge of what we would consider to be the world. It's fascinating that so much sophistication was being attempted and was happening in what seems to us as a very peripheral place.
Okay, well, let's just.
It seems to have come to an end. Let's say for the sake of it, let's say 2,500 BC. It seems to have no one was living there anymore.
Perfect. Before we go into the village and the settlement itself, can we just talk a little bit broadly about where we are in the human story at this point? If we say 2,500 BC, it feels like a tremendously long time ago to me. I suppose it's not. I don't know what an archaeologist would say. They might think that was yesterday or something. But is this kind of in that cusp between the Stone Age and the Bronze Age? Am I about right there? Is that,
yes. At the time, you are right, because at the time, now you have to that 3-age system between Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron. It wasn't the boundaries between stone and bronze and iron. They don't happen everywhere at the same time.
Yeah, it wasn't like on a Friday. And
there's transitions from one technology or one way of living to another, and it happens wide. I mean, it happens across an unimaginable depth of time. People began domesticating crops and animals somewhere in the territory we would think of as the Middle East about 10,000 years ago. It took thousands of years for that technology to reach Orkney. That move to farming after millennia of hunting, and it wasn't abrupt. I mean, people didn't stop hunting on the Friday and start farming on the Monday. There's a blurring, and it spreads like a patch of damp across a wall, and at that kind of speed, really. Yes, as you say, in answer to your question there, the time that I'm interested in of the abandonment or the coming to an end of the way of life that had been at Skara Brae for 600 years, which is a long time. It coincides with when life was changing on Orkney for many different reasons, and you are in the territory there of metal. Metal is coming, and different ideas are there. And it's the abandonment of Skara Brae may have been caused because after a long periods when people lived in self-contained village communities, able to look after themselves, make their own decisions, collect as a kind of a big extended family, let's say, there seems to have then been a change, possibly driven by climate change, which may have made the living harder on Orkney around that time. And it may also have been exacerbated, if you like, if that's the right word, by the emergence of elites. Okay, so where there had been maybe just isolated villages doing their own thing, getting on with it, growing their food, raising their kids, there may have been the rise of a kind of an elite class that wanted to take collective control and tell people where to live and how to live. So that's why that date, that coming to an end of Skara Brae is so interesting, because it seems to overlap with a time when Orkney and Northern Europe were on the cusp of change.
Well, we're lucky to have listeners everywhere, America, Australia, and India, everywhere. Let's do a little bit of geography and explain where actually Orkney, where are we talking about? Can you give us a kind of geographical picture of this settlement?
Yeah, I mean, if you can picture the British Isles, if you can picture that long island with the island of Ireland off to the west, separated from the long island of England, Scotland, and Wales by the Irish Sea. If you look north of the north coast of Scotland, there's a little scattering of islands. In fact, there's two. There's a little scattering of islands, and then slightly further north, there's another one. They're like dropped breadcrumbs floating on the sea. And the one that's more southerly is Orkney, and the one that's slightly more northerly is Shetland.
I remember this great description you had in The Wisdom of the Ancients, which is the other book we spoke about, when you said one of these islands belonged to fishermen that farm and the others belong to farmers that fish. And I thought that was
that's right. The Orcadians are traditionally described as farmers who fish, and the Shetlanders are fishermen who farm, which just gives you that slight where their hearts really lay, or that which they depended upon most for their culture and their food supply and all the rest of it. And as I mentioned earlier, we have a perception. If you watch the weather forecast in Britain, Orkney and Shetland actually sometimes appear in a box. They're actually like they pull them down because they would be kind of out of the picture. So they kind of stick them in a box and pull them into the view.
Usually with quite a rain cloud over the top, I suppose.
Yeah, well. And you're invited to think that Orkney and Shetland are just out there where the buses don't go, out on the edge. But geographically, they are peripheral now. But at different times, different places in the world have mattered. In Britain now, we're preoccupied with the southeast of England. Because London's where the monarch is, it's where the parliament is, where all the decisions are made. That southeast corner is where the mass of the population live. And it's tempting to think that that's always been the important place. But archaeological evidence demonstrates pretty conclusively that around 3000 BC, and for a long time, maybe for 1,000 years, up until about 2000 BC, Orkney really mattered. The first henges ever, which is to say those circular monuments, which are ditches with banks, the earliest that we know about are on Orkney, which means that whatever that was about, a science, a religion, a combination of both, a means of understanding the cosmos and our place within it, it occurred to people on Orkney before it occurred to people anywhere else. And then it spread like an infection, like a virus, down through the long island of Britain, so that you wouldn't have Stonehenge and Avebury, the iconic prehistoric monuments. They simply wouldn't have existed had it not been for whoever on Orkney thought the way to understand things is to build these circles. And the house form of Skara Brae, when we get into it, the typical shape is, if you imagine, they're kind of rectangular. It's a big room. Each house is a big room, not quite square, and the corners are rounded like the edges of a playing card. You know how you get sort of softly rounded corners.
Yeah.
And they also used, they dressed their houses so they would have when you were in the door, which was a crawl space, you had to get down on your hands and knees and crawl into these houses. You'd be confronted by what they call a dresser, which is a set of stone shelves, which were presumably for display. People were putting the equivalent of their wedding crockery on it, things of value, so that you were confronted by the family wealth as soon as you came through the door. That configuration is mimicked in Neolithic settlements down the long island of Britain, so that you get to somewhere like Durrington Walls, which is a Neolithic settlement which was occupied during the heyday of Stonehenge. Although they were building the houses of different material, which is to say timber, they're kind of square, kind of rectangular, with rounded corners, with dressers, timber. They're also using the same pottery, grooved ware pottery, which was invented on Orkney. It's a style you make the pottery mimic something that's been made from like reeds. It's called a skeuomorph. You're using a different material, but you're mimicking features and characteristics of the earlier thing. So you continue to make something that looks like woven reeds by mimicking its look. So that seems to have been the inspiration for grooved ware. And the oldest of it is on Orkney, but it's at Durrington Walls and everywhere else in between.
It's a fascinating dynamic to think of things coming. It's so contrary, as you say, to.
It's funny. It makes me smile because it's almost like IKEA. It's as if Orkney was the original IKEA, and they came up with a set of furniture that everybody ended up wanting. And it's
I'm trying to think of the flat pack kind of cartoon that would appear in.
Well, the flat pack was the idea, was the understanding that travelled in people's heads.
Yeah.
And so it seems that idea of Orkney was somewhere important. But there are places up there that we call Ness of Brodgar, the Stones of Stennis, the Ring of Brodgar, that the people 2,000 and 3,000 years BC, even in Northern Europe, would have known the name. They would have said, let's go to, the way we would go to Canterbury or to Westminster Abbey. These places on Orkney would have had names that were known, because these were places that people, to some extent, wanted to get to, like Meccas. They were places with a magnetic pull. And although they appear peripheral and out on the edge to us now, well, it wasn't always like that.
So let's go there. I mean, this is a great, superb setup. We give you this kind of 3-scene sequence to go through. Let's go and have a look at Skara Brae. Where would you like to go? Let's let it live before it kind of falls a bit.
Very much so, yes.
So where would you like to go for your first scene? I mean, just give us, what would you choose first?
It's in the nature of, because, as we say, we can't be precise in the way that you would be about, picking a year of relevance in the Second World War or whatever. In my time machine that people often offer me, I would just want to be an invisible observer. What was happening at Skara Brae, that way of life, so long ago, getting on for 5,000 years ago, is so different from us that the opportunity to just be invisible and watch a day in the life would be like you might as well be watching people from another planet. Yeah. And I want to smell how they smelled. I want to listen to their talk. The language that was manifest in Orkney at that time has roots that go all the way back to the Indian subcontinent. So you're looking at languages that have some of their deepest roots in Sanskrit, and they travel with the people who eventually are in that part of the world, that's the antecedents of Cornish and Irish Gaelic and Scots Gaelic and British, the British language that was spoken before the Romans came with their Latin ways. So I'd want to, just even though I wouldn't be able to understand them, I'd just like to hear the crack, hear them talk, and watch them going about their business. And they lived these sort of visceral lives where they were surrounded by their nature in the way that a fish is surrounded by water. And the houses at Skara Brae now, they appear like they've been burrowed into a hillside, but in fact because they were being built and sort of levelled and rebuilt over hundreds of years. They started out as freestanding structures, but then they packed them around with their own waste. In Scots, the word is midden material. So the food waste, everything you can think of. So it must have stunk to high heaven in terms of our sensibilities of how it is to live. So that life in Skara Brae in these houses would have been lived in a kind of a steaming fug of humanity, of unwashed bodies, all packed around, and it was done deliberately because it helped insulate the buildings. Life in Orkney is tough. It's cold. It's a challenging climate for a lot of the year. So they packed their own mess and waste around it to help insulate it.
How would I'm just thinking, how would these humans have been, or these inhabitants of the settlement have been different to us today?
Their sensibilities. These are the people. I mean, their circumstances differed unimaginably from ours, and the way they thought. These are the people who built the monuments, like the standing stones at Stennis, like the Ring of Brodgar, the great chamber tomb of Maes Howe. And you can't stick a shovel in the ground in Orkney without hitting archaeology. It's peppered and littered with archaeology of the Neolithic. In particular, that time of the first farmers, it's thick on the ground there, and the way they understood the world, they made sense of it in some way that manifests itself in the creation of these huge monuments. When they at Brodgar, amongst many things that have been noticed about it, some of the stones were brought to that place from all over the archipelago of Orkney, as though people from far-flung communities made their contribution to this monument by bringing some of the bedrock of their patch, so that collectively the Ring of Brodgar is Orkney as one, all brought together. And I want to be amongst those people and say, what are you doing? How is it that you understand the world? Because
what I was just thinking about then is that in your archaeological work and in your writing, you often go looking for these very transient moments. It might be the hint of a footprint, or just you might see a place where something has subtly been worn down over years with like repeated motion. Is there any, I know we have the structures that remain. What evidence of the people remains? Is there little glimpses we can, catch?
Yes. I mean, for example, the houses that are entered, there's about 10. There's 10 houses there now, the remains thereof. There may have been many more. We may only have the surviving fragment of something much larger. And in each case, there's a very low door that you have to get down on your hands and knees and crawl through. It's probably all part of the insulation and keeping drafts out. You keep the doors as small as possible. And then, as I mentioned before, you're confronted on the back wall in front of you with this dresser. And the dressers would have had on them things like there's enigmatic carved stone balls from Skara Brae that no one understands. The size of a cricket ball, carved and shaped. And there's no consensus as to what they were for, but let's imagine something like that, one or two on the dresser. Maybe other items. They were working with whalebone, and they were working with stone. They were working with organic materials. So although we only see the stone, and it's tempting always to think of a sort of meet the Flintstones, as if They just, everything was stone. Everything would have been softened with an organic element that hasn't survived. Furs and animal skins and fleece from sheep and all the rest of it, softening it, bedding. But you'd walk in and always on the right-hand side, there's a slightly bigger bed. It's like Goldilocks and the Three Bears. And on the left, there's a slightly smaller bed. And the assumption is that of the husband and the wife sleeping on, that the big bed's the male bed and the smaller bed is the woman. But each house is configured in this way. And it's a form that persisted in Orcadian society right up into remembered history, where the bedroom was split like that, so that the husband had a bed and the wife had a bed. They weren't necessarily sleeping in the same bed. So these things have echoes that go all the way back to the Neolithic. They would have been they raised cattle and sheep. We know that they grew barley. So they were farmers of both animals and of cereals. We know that they caught fish. We know that the whalebone featured, because by the time of the building of Skara Brae, wood would have been in short supply, if there ever really was much in the way of tree cover on Orkney at any point. There certainly wouldn't have been much by then. So it begs the question, what did they use for rafters, for the big structural elements? So were the whalebone, was there a whalebone form as the structure for a roof? What was it roofed with? Well, right down into the modern era, homes on Orkney were roofed in seaweed and turf. Or was it stone? It may have been tiled, but with big, because the stone of Orkney, the way they were able to, the way they used it for building the big stone circles, the bedrock is a kind of a sandstone that naturally splits. So it's like the perfect Lego. You can build anything you want with it. So they may have used thin slabs as, so tiled roofs on the structure. So they had a rich life. They had a life of home comforts. There would have been fires. There were square settings for a fire in each house, built of stone. They had flushing toilets. Believe it or believe it not, there were in each house. There's a little kind of cubby hole, a little sort of chamber, into which you can crawl, and they would have done their toilette in there, and then with a bucket of water, they flushed the waste out into drains, and there were drains with seawater running through them that would have carried the waste out to the sea. So they had kind of indoor plumbing, if you like, 5,000 years ago.
So what you're describing is a society or a settlement in any case that's reasonably advanced. There's technological progress. I mean, the thing about Wales is quite intriguing to me. I was wondering whether these might be kind of scavenged bones from whales that might have beached.
Could be. And they could have been using driftwood from the same sources as well.
But that's another great ponderable, I suppose.
Yes.
But it's, to walk through that settlement at that time.
There's another glimpse that we should touch on in one of the houses. In one of the houses, I've mentioned these stone beds. Bed settings, really. I mean, if you imagine, like, thin slabs set vertically to delineate a rectangular space that would then have been filled with softness of whatever, vegetation, fur, fleece, whatever, to make a soft bed. But in one of the houses, excavation beneath the bed setting revealed the skeletons side by side of two women. Okay, so two members of the society had died, and we would obviously think about removing their remains and burying them or cremating them elsewhere. But for whatever reason, the way these people understood death, they kept them in the house and basically buried them under the bed.
Yeah.
And that's so different. Imagine us doing that today. Imagine us retaining the mortal remains of loved ones and keeping them in the house. It's so different. And yet, in many ways, it's better, because we've grown so distanced from death.
It's almost invisible, isn't it?
We're traumatized by the very thought of it, and professionals come and take away our dead. We don't want to see them. The minute someone ceases to be alive, we kind of want them out of the house. And then we never really see them again. And the undertaker prepares them and puts them in a box, and that box is either buried or cremated. We don't see, but these people retained a connection, a physical connection to their dead, which I think in many ways is a more grown up approach
Yeah, and probably
in
avoids
many ways.
a kind of trauma of a kind of very sharp separation, as you say, because if something just vanishes one day and is never seen again, that's in itself quite difficult to compute.
So we
And
think of them as the primitives, but in many ways, I think they absolutely were not. I think they were more open and in touch with and understanding of the realities of life and death. And if you're not properly in awe of death, you're not properly in awe of life. These people had it in the round. The way that the chamber tombs that have been excavated in Orkney and elsewhere, the bodies seem to have been laid out somewhere else, or maybe briefly buried until the flesh was away, and then the bones were collected and brought into these communal spaces, where the bones of the dead become one great receptacle of the ancestors, and the tombs remained open, like churches. We talk about these tombs as if they were only about the dead, but that's like saying just because there are graves around a church, that a church is only about death. But of course it's not. It's about christenings and marriages, and it's about everything to do with life. And likewise, these that we call tombs, and we know that people were going in and taking the bones back out again. It looks as if they were probably taking the ancestors home from time to time, or doing other things with them. So they were physically happy. They were happy to be in touch with the mortal remains of their dead. And there's such a richness about that, I think. We think that as disgusting, morbid, even perverse. But they were simply, the dead were around them and part of life, literally and metaphorically.
And it adds so much to the atmosphere of the place, which is, as you say, very different to our own. I want to get now to your second scene, which is where, having kind of sketched what we know of what was there, we encounter the mystery. So is this going to be, we can't say with any chronological certainty when this happened. Maybe you can, but tell us what is the mystery of Skara Brae?
Well, why did people stop living there? Because at the time people stopped living there, the houses were still serviceable structures, maintained. It looks more like a decision to go. For
an
a long
abandonment.
Time, yeah. For a long time, there still is actually, depending on who you speak to, there's always been a sort of a folk tradition that Skara Brae came back to light in 1850. It was a huge storm. It hit the Bay of Scale, which is where Skara Brae is, and it partly exposed the ruins for the first time in thousands of years. And they were subsequently excavated, having been revealed in that way. And there was a long tradition that there had come one terrible night, 2,500 years ago, there was an apocalyptic storm, and people fled, and it was all dressed up with the finds of like a broken jewelry, like a string of beads found in a doorway, and the people at the site would tell you this was a woman, and she's even as she's fleeing in the face of the storm, her necklace is torn, from her neck, and maybe her husband comes back and says, leave it, and drags her away from the encroaching, whatever it is, sandstorm, the sea, whatever. And so Pompeii was considered as a kind of an Orcadian Skara Brae was considered as a sort of Orcadian Pompeii, as though it had been not overtaken by pyroclastic flow, but by the sea or by the sand. But that's not what happened. The way of life changed. It was no longer deemed appropriate to live like that. And it wouldn't have been the case that everybody left the same day. There was just a turning your back on that way of life. Maybe the younger people, maybe there came a generation who didn't want to live like that. And maybe the older people were left behind. And maybe that older generation lived out their lives in a Skara Brae that was no longer as vibrant as before. And in the future, people lived in, rather than living in these communal villages, maybe 10, 20 houses all clustered together like cells in a sponge, they started to live in isolated single houses. So whatever, mum, dad and the kids have their house, and then there's maybe half a mile to the next house. And that seems, there's theorizing that Orkney as a whole was ruled by an elite, a priestly class or a kingly class or a warrior class and they told people how to live. So it no longer mattered to be in your village. You were just the people of Orkney. And people, it may have been to do with climate. It may have, the fertility of the land may have diminished somewhat. If it became wetter, if there was more rain, if there was less available land for farming and it was less productive, that would provoke a change in the way that people lived and understood the landscape. But so it's this fascination with the idea that there came a gradual period where what had been the right way to live for hundreds of years was no longer the way to live. And I'm endlessly fascinated by, for example, we call Stonehenge Stonehenge. And it's because an early description of it was of the hanging stones, because the lintels, it's like these trilithons with a lintel, like a doorway. So it's the place of hanging stones, Stonehenge. But we don't know what they called it. Now, people used Stonehenge and modified it for hundreds of years. And we don't know what it was called, and we don't really know what it was used for. Now, there must have come a generation who just weren't going to use that place for whatever anymore. But they must still have known what it was called, and they would still have known what their parents and grandparents had done there. And their children would have known that as well. But there obviously comes a time of forgetting, where eventually you've got to a generation who, if you stopped them and said, those stones over there, what's that? They would have to say, I've got no idea.
Yeah. And I think it's on that.
So Skara Brae is the same. There has to have come a time when people lived. There was a time, a long time when people lived there. Then there was a time of its decline, and then it's abandoned, and enough time goes by that it's lost. It was known, it's called Skara Brae because before the storm of 1850 that exposed it, it was called Skara Brae, which has various sort of etymological explanations, but it seems to be Norse words that basically talk about the bump by the reef. So it was simply a descriptive of a morphology, a bump. Maze How, the How of Maze How, which is the chamber turn. How is a Norse word for a hill. And some of the same roots are in the Skara Brae. In any event, it's a complicated etymology, but long after people had known that there was a village there, it just entered their language as the bump by the reef, because they had forgotten what it had ever been. And I'm fascinated by the process of forgetting.
This is
Somewhere
also
that was a civilization for 600 years. There comes a day when people don't even remember it was ever there.
Yeah,
I find that amazing.
Yeah, it is amazing, and it also connects to something else that I've read in your writing, which directly connects to us today, which is all of us here alive now, apart from maybe a few kind of extraordinary examples, will be forgotten about within 4 generations. And
yes, if your great grandchildren remember you, that's as good as it's going to get. Their children won't know you ever existed.
And this is maybe a sense that archaeologists have and are reminded of, with their work about these, these stories that have kind of come to an end, and they have to be re-examined and, kind of burst back open again. But it's just a natural.
It's so important to internalize that way of thinking, though, because we are so preoccupied with now. We're so wrapped up in today, and we're so wrapped up in how much life we can get for ourselves. Trying to extend our lives, because most people now in the West don't really believe in anything. You're here and then you're gone, and it's all just about maximizing your own greedily held bit of life, your time, and trying to be 100 years old with ripped abs and all your own teeth. That's the objective now. And it's so important to remember that no matter who you are and what you do, with only a handful of exceptions, come the time of your great grandchildren, they won't even know you existed. And that contextualizes and gives perspective to our aches and pains and our cares.
And it also stands as a kind of different way of thinking about the past, because we're so often schooled, and we're always cautioned against this as historians, but this idea that we're on a linear path, that things just kind of get a bit better as the centuries as they march by, you know. But really, it's what you're describing here is something which is much more like a circle, maybe, that something begins, it thrives, it prospers, it becomes maybe a superfluous, then it, you know, is eventually abandoned, and then it's forgotten. So that's a kind of different picture, but one which is maybe part of the rhythm of our world. Is that right?
Yes. You know, there is a rise and fall. You know, there is a time to sow and a time to reap. You know, things like empires come. You know, the Persian, the Roman, Genghis Khan, and no matter how big they get, and the European Union, no matter how, you know, there's a sort of fallacy about, you know, things get too big to fail, but the experience of thousands of years of history is that things always fail. However big they get, they must fail. They must come to an end. Nothing, no matter how grandiose, no matter how many people buy into it, it finishes. Everything comes to an end.
And this is,
and then something else, and then something starts, and then something new, something supplants it. That's just the way of it.
And so with our second scene, just to condense what we've been talking about, it would be to catch this at the moment of change, you know.
Yes, and it's not an apocalyptic event. It would be to watch, I suppose, in time lapse. You know, like one of these speeded up things that shows a flower coming and then, you know, and falling away. It would be to time lapse, maybe across 2 or 3 generations, around the time of 2500 BC, when, for probably a complicated cocktail of reasons, people didn't think this was the appropriate way to live anymore. That village is the past. We don't do that anymore. And our parents and grandparents, what they thought, it wasn't right. And the time has come to live, and more people switch to living in the alternative way, until Skara Brae is under the grass and gone.
So that takes us nicely to probably the second part of the mystery, which is your third scene, the thing that I suppose the detective in you, the kind of questing journalist, archaeologist that we spoke about right at the beginning would like to find out, which is maybe where did these people go? Those people who built the great circles, the tombs of stone. What was their new beginnings and futures? And I suppose it's obviously. Well, do you want to tell me, like, kind of what you think, or maybe what science has exposed as an answer to these questions? Archaeology.
We have touched on some of it. There seems to have been some climate change. Orkney may have been a kind of a not Eden, but maybe the living was relatively easy there for a long time, and it gave people the spare time to do the things like the Great Henge monuments, Ring of Brodgar, the Ness of Brodgar, which is the Ness of Brodgar is in between the Stones of Stennis and the Ring of Brodgar. And it seems to have been some kind of location where there were special houses or special structures in which special things happened, and it functioned in some coherent way for maybe 1,000 years, and then it it just was abandoned. So there's all across Orkney, it seems that a way of life which was deeper than memory came to an end, and it might have been provoked to some extent by that life maybe just became harder and demanded different ways of living, and there may have been the coming of an elite who were in control, or they were seeking to have control. I mean, we see it now. You know, you see these things. You know, people are talking now this very day about the return of authoritarianism and totalitarianism, and secretive cabals, taking control of the world. I mean, that conversation is out there now. But it seems that there was a change, that there had been a rise of a new elite group who said, we no longer live like that. We live this way now, and we're going to do these things, and we understand the cosmos in this way. And it wasn't overnight. It was the stuff of generations. And gradually they drifted away from the previous way of living, and they took on a new way of living. And there's the main work of excavation, proper scientific excavation, was first undertaken in the late 1920s by an Australian guy called Vere Gordon Child. And he is a fascinating figure in his own right. There's something opposite about Skara Brae being thought about first by him, because he's, he walked to the beat of his own drum. He was a Marxist. And back in Australia, he sort of exiled himself from academic circles because of his Marxism and his socialism. He fell from sort of polite society. And then he came to Britain. First of all, he was in London, and then he became I think it's the Abercrombie Chair of Archaeology at Edinburgh University. So a professorship was created for him, and he came, and from his base in Edinburgh, he then became involved in excavations at Skara Brae. He thought Skara Brae was Iron Age. He thought the people had lived there in the early centuries AD. He got his timings all wrong. I mean, obviously he came from a time way before radiocarbon dating and such like. So his chronologies were all wrong. But he understood what he understood of it, and he did the work, and he did the first excavations, and then he was so disillusioned in his later years, and believed that both capitalism and even the communist model were failing, and he was predicting in the 1930s and 40s a descent into the whole of Europe would descend into a new dark age. The people having been failed by the sort of economic and ideological models of both capitalist and communist. And that's strangely prescient, given that so many people at the moment are worried about what does all this mean? Where are we going? The Great Reset, is society on the cusp of yet another? V. Gordon Child coined the term the Neolithic Revolution. He believed that the change that happened, where people took on farming after all the millennia of hunting was nothing less than a revolution. And so he was setting it into the sort of chronology that then gives you things like, the Industrial Revolution, or the Soviet Revolution in Russia. These moments of great, and it was he that came up with the idea that Skara Brae had been wiped out overnight by a storm. That was his fiction.
Yeah.
And he became so disillusioned that, in fact, when he was 65, he went back to Australia, and he spent some time touring the country, found that he was very disappointed with Australia, that people were too suburban. He didn't like the ideology of the people. He wrote some letters to some friends, and then he took himself off to some wild country, and he looks like he jumped 1,000 feet off a cliff and ended his life. And he left a letter that wasn't to a friend, and which was sent in 1957, and it wasn't to be opened until 1968. And when that letter was opened, it made it pretty clear that he had believed that he had come to the end of his useful life, and he wanted to go out while he was still hale and hearty. So it made it pretty clear that he had committed suicide, but that his story is inextricably linked with Skara Brae.
This is a thing.
Another gloss that makes the whole story, even more fascinating.
It seems to me that there's, in some ways, it survives as a site, as a kind of model of, or maybe a kind of standard from which we've drifted in a way. So I suppose the question I put to you is this a kind of settlement that's alive in your mind often when we come to moments like lockdowns, for example, and you think of the separation of people and nature and things like that? Is that where, as you've written before in things like the wisdom of the ancients, that we could actually benefit from thinking more about these places like Skara Brae and maybe visiting them, I don't know, but at least keeping them in mind?
I think so. I get a great deal, I've written and spoken about it often, that I get a great deal of comfort and solace from looking into the deep past. When the present is troubling and filled with anxiety, I like to look back, because you see that the same disruptions and the same things have happened again and again and again. like at the moment, and a way of life that has seemed so permanent that it will always be there, it comes to an end, and people start to live differently. And Skara Brae is a kind of a memorial to that. That people lived a certain way for a long time, and then they didn't. And we don't know why, but we speculate about it. And now we seem to be going through a period in the 21st century of maybe we are being reset. Maybe we are going to embark upon a different way of living for a complicated cocktail of reasons. But if you're troubled by it, there's surely some solace in realizing that this has happened again and again and again. And there are just generations who get, they're dealt a hand of cards that is, you're going to live through a period of change. And then maybe there'll be a period of stability. People forget that change ever happens, but maybe we are the generation that is going to experience change. We're straddling change. And if you're made anxious by it, well, look back.
Look backwards.
Skara Brae, I think about it often. It's one of the places that does, haunt my imagination. As I say, I would love to go back and just sit quietly on the grass on a decent day and just watch a day in the life of Skara Brae and listen to them and smell the smells and hear the noise and see what they were about. And there's what's his name, that wrote Metroland, Julian Barnes. He's got a great line at the end of Metroland where he says, "Objects contain absent people." It's actually in reference to a set of coffee cups. And he looks up at the 4 cups and he knows that they represent 4 friends that drink from those cups. But objects contain absent people. And a place like Skara Brae contains absent people. And when you go to a place like that, or when I go to a place like that, because I'm not scientific about it, I use these places, I enjoy the way they make my imagination run, and I like speculating about them and what-ifing about them. And sometimes I think of a Skara Brae as being like, if you don't touch your computer for a while and it goes on a sort of standby, it just it goes into that little routine where it's protecting the screen. But when you come back and you touch the touchpad, it comes back. And I think if you go to a place like Skara Brae with your imagination, you kind of your presence there reanimates something about the place, or it does in my imagination, and I get a great deal of comfort from that. It pleases me to do that. However unscientific and fairy tale like that is, I feel that my presence there brings these places back on.
And I'd say the same for people who are listening about the book as well, because the story of the world in 100 moments kind of acts in a similar way, each of them being maybe like, a little provocation, being a bit like a brand hub. I've thought of, you plunge your hand in, you see what comes out, you see what it means to you, and you see how it maybe challenges your thinking, confronts you. This has been a really fascinating conversation. I've got one last question to it. I didn't warn you about this, so you might have to do a bit of thinking on your feet. But I like to get a bit of material history. And if you could have brought a tangible object back from Skara Brae in around, say, the year 2500 BC, is there anything you'd like to have? You could have it maybe on your own mantelpiece. I don't know. Is there anything in particular that you would like? I'll give you a moment to think about it.
The carved stone balls are an endless fascination, because in all likelihood we will never know what they represented to those people. So I've actually got a modern facsimile of such on one of my bookshelves. But in truth, I've never really been. I am most moved by the everyday. Something like one of these carved stone balls is probably to do with some sort of ceremony, and something that was used occasionally, and may have been held in some kind of reverence. I'm much more attracted. If I could have anything from Skara Brae, I would want something like a stone tool. Something that was just of the everyday.
Yeah.
That someone periodically.
It's kind of charged up through repetitive touching and use,
and it's just
with personality.
Because it has that patina of use about it that's made of the person who owned it and used it. So I would want something as basic as, a sharp stone knife, or similar. That I would like something that just speaks of the everyday, not the special days, not the high days and holidays. I would like something that had just been in someone's pocket for the whole of their life, and then one strange day it got lost, and then I would have it and thereby be connected to that person by
Absolutely.
our ownership of the same thing.
Superb choice. I'll repeat that quote that you mentioned a few minutes ago. Objects contain absent people, and charged up within that tool would be so much of the personality of the person who'd used it. Well, Neil Oliver, this has been, for me, an absolute treat. I hope everyone else has enjoyed it too.
So that was me, Peter Moore, talking to Neil Oliver today about this book, The Story of the World in 100 Moments, in which you'll find more about the story of the little girl in the red dress. And Skara Brae is more apparent, I suppose, in this book, which is The Wisdom of the Ancients, which is pretty much has described what happened in the ancient world that we've lost and what might we learn by rediscovering it again. If you have enjoyed this video, please do subscribe for more. We'll be back with another episode very shortly. All the very best to you. Goodbye.